Chapter 6. Labor 6th. How Hercules destroyed the Harpies. The neighborhood of the lake Stymphalus, in Arcadia, was infested by certain carnivorous birds whose quarry was the human species. They are said to have resembled cranes or storks, but the crane and stork are not anthropophagous, but fish-eaters, and partial to frogs. The adjutant, or gigantic crane, to be sure, is piscivorous in a wider sense, with it all being fish that comes to net, but it does not catch sepoys. The stymphalids most likely were immense vultures if they were anything at all. Whatever they were, it is recorded in the various mythologies that Hercules shot them. Now there was formerly a sort of stymphalids in Angeland. To what particular class to refer them would puzzle an ornithologist. Their natures and dispositions were a compound of the raven, carrion crow, vulture, kite, and buzzard. They resembled the last two creatures, especially in their generous disposition to prey upon the weak and defenseless. They had likewise so much of the heron in them, as a strong appetite for gudgeons, and as the albatross devours its fellow creatures the gulls, even so did they. They were foul, filthy, cruel, and rapacious. Let us call them harpies. It will have been divined by the reader that these harpies belonged to the genus Homo. So, apparently they did, though perhaps in reality they were of the class Diabolus, for they were decidedly inhuman. But their resemblance to the harpy was, in the majority of instances, not merely a moral one. By far the greater number of them had that prominent feature of the face, the organ of smell, very like, in conformation, to the beak of the harpy. These individuals were of a certain persuasion, though what they were persuaded of, except that the grand rule of conduct was to get money, it is not easy to conceive. Besides their nasal peculiarity, they possessed the pleasing personal advantages of thick, pouting, and everted lips, and a lozenge-like eye, of the variety termed goggle, protruding attractively from its socket. Their countenances were radiant with a smirk of complacent baseness and self-applauding cunning. The elder of them were altogether shabby, the younger, dirty and fine. Their names were for the most part those of a certain wise king, of that king's father, and of the head of a particular priesthood. But these names they generally clipped and abbreviated, as if they were ashamed of them, although, in truth, they were not ashamed of anything. The rest of the harpies had the eyes, nose, and mouth of the Christian, and some of them actually pretended to that title, going to chapel on Sundays 3 times a day, and while there, groaning and looking dismal, and calling themselves miserable sinners, which nobody could deny that they were. The prey of these harpies was twofold. One kind corresponded to that most attenuated of quadrupeds, the church mouse, the other to that remarkably tender bird, the green goose. The church mouse was an unfortunate wight who wanted a few pounds on an emergency, the green goose a young fool with expectations, who would fain squander his fortune beforehand. Necessity placed the mouse, extravagance the goose, in the power of the harpies. There is an amusement in which our youth often indulge, denominated the flying of kites. A species of kite flying was also practiced by the youth of our ancestors, and by others of them. There is this difference, however, between the two games, that whereas our boys must first have the wind raised before they can fly their kites, kites were flown formerly to raise the wind. Now the church mice and the green geese were the chief flyers of kites, and thus it was that they became the prey of the harpies. By certain means, which the legal hydra, pandering to the voracity of the harpies, afforded, the latter were enabled to despoil the green geese and church mice even unto nakedness, and plague them afterwards to boot. These means were designated by 2 cabalistic phrases, fieri facias, and capias ad satisfaciendum, and by them were effected execution and imprisonment for debt. By execution, a debtor, with his wife and family, was reduced to destitution and beggary. By imprisonment the poor wretch was tormented, and all who depended on him starved. Among the various social phenomena occasioned by these processes, the woman about to become a mother turned shivering into the snow, the sick child expiring on the dunghill, the distracted father blowing his brains out were matters of frequent occurrence. These benevolent contrivances for the benefit of the harpies were maintained by the British public out of a tender regard on the part of its members for their beloved pockets, and a modest distrust of their own penetration. which led them to take every precaution against the contingency of being cheated. It never occurred to them that it would be sufficient to punish the fraudulent debtor as a rogue. Hercules, on beholding the ravages of these miscreant harpies, was moved to an extremity of compassion and wrath. And when he came to scan their hard, pitiless, yellow, ill-omened faces, and to look into their greedy, mean, and cruel eyes, his celestial ichor so boiled with indignant contempt and hatred, that he could have found in his heart literally to dash the whole brood of them to atoms. He reined in, however, the excess of his ire, and, leaving the individual caitiffs, with his malison, to go their own way to Erebus, took measures for exterminating the species. Having first placarded the town with notices of his intention, he gave a lecture on the law of debtor and creditor at Exeter Hall, where he appeared on the platform in a respectable suit of black and a white neckcloth. He began by complimenting his audience on the singular freedom from hypocrisy which characterized the British nation, and on the conformity of its practice with the code which it professed to follow. The compliment was acknowledged with loud cheers. He then enumerated certain precepts of the code in question, such as those generally recommending justice and benevolence, and particularly that which required the forgiveness of debts, and the surrender of a coat to one who took a cloak. And he demonstrated the beautiful accordance therewith of the law which he had undertaken to handle. He showed that debt, unless a swindling transaction, was a contract entered into with a risk, and, in case of its unavoidable non-fulfillment, how consistent it was with the maxim, "Do unto others as you would be done by," to ruin a debtor and consign him to a dungeon. Then he drew so delightfully pathetic a picture of the workings of the law with respect not only to the prisoner, but his wife and children, that all the ladies present cried bitterly. To be sure, he was interrupted occasionally by murmurs and cries of, "Oh! Oh!" But on the whole his discourse produced a serious impression, and the majority of his hearers looked grave and thoughtful, as if really a rather new light had begun to dawn upon their minds. He wound up his speech by a strong panegyric upon the harpies in general, whom, however, he did not call harpies, but highly respectable men, and upon the considerate regard of the legislature for their interests and well-being. Having concluded, he sat down in perfect silence. No one rose to reply to him, and the assembly separated looking extremely foolish. Very shortly afterwards, a grand discovery was made by the sagacious public, namely, that punishment for debt was contrary to the spirit of their religion. The harpies now began to yell and scream wondrously, in great trepidation and alarum, the rather that Hercules had begun to discharge against them his inevitable and deadly arrows. The wounds which they therefrom received were so fearfully envenomed, that the wretches swelled up like bloated reptiles, and became, as it were, noisome among men. They were only seen to be execrated. Their company was shunned like a pestilence, and to such a pitch had the popular animosity against them arisen, that they stood in bodily fear. And now the legislature, galled by the stray shafts of the hero, and overawed by the cry of the people for right and justice, at once utterly abolished the laws which maintained them in being, and their pernicious and hateful existence was happily terminated forever. Chapter 7. Labor the Seventh. How Hercules caught and tamed a prodigious wild bull, which ravaged a certain island. Hercules was a bull hunter of old. It is on record that he captured a wild and very mischievous bull, which laid waste the island of Crete. The HERCULES, or descendants of Hercules, had they flourished at a later epoch, might have taken the name and arms of Turnbull. The heralds, college, surely would have had no objection to their doing so. The hero, in his deified state, did likewise catch and tame a notable bull, Bull No. 2. This bull was a bull who made himself very troublesome in an island contiguous unto Great Britain, forming, indeed, a third of the United Kingdom, and so powerful was he that he nearly turned it upside down. In fact, this island was Hibernia, so that the bull was an Irish bull. However, the reader must know that he was positively an Irish bull, in which respect he differed from certain other bulls of that nation. This bull was a very fat bull. He had no horns, that we know of, so that he did not gore anybody. Still he was very dangerous. He possessed a marvelous gift of bellowing, whereby he was wont to create frequent disturbances in the island, to the perilous excitement of the turbulent part of the population, and the disquiet and alarm of the more peaceable inhabitants. Probably it was on account of this faculty of roaring that he was named the Great O, that letter energetically pronounced being imitative of a roar. The noises which he used to make were so terrible that they shook the whole island like an earthquake, to such an extent as at times to render its utter disjunction from the sister kingdom a thing to be apprehended. Hence it was that he was also denominated agitator. He consumed a wonderful amount of provender annually, in the shape of a material which in the language of the country was called rent. This provender he obtained by dint of his roaring, which was rather musical to the ears of the majority of the Hibernians, who, to tell the truth, were somewhat of an obstreperous disposition, but who also expected to derive certain advantages from it, hoping that it would terrify the adjoining country into conceding to them certain rights and privileges, which, as they conceived, it had unjustly withheld from them. They therefore, though they could ill afford it, supplied him copiously with the rent, to encourage him to bellow and roar. This bull had a kinsman, whose name was John Bull, who lived over the water, and to whom the hullabaloo which he kept up was extremely annoying. John particularly disapproved of the earthquakes which the Irish bull was occasioning, and looked forward to their possible consequence with much uneasiness. He roared out to him to be quiet, it was of no use. He roared to those who had the common charge of himself and the other bull, to interfere and keep him in order. They could not, they knew not what to do. So that at last he roared out for help to Hercules. Hercules, ever inclined to act as a peacemaker, acceded readily to the roar of John Bull. The hero's intentions becoming known, it was thought by many that he would embark for Hibernia by the first steamer, and instantly proceed to reduce the animal to reason with his club. But upon consideration, he found that whatever induced the Hibernian bull to bellow, there was, as a matter of fact, no little reason in his roar, at least on the part of those who upheld him therein. For they, for the most part, had been reduced to live on potatoes and salt, a diet which he felt would, in his mortal state, have made him cry out, or get anybody he could to cry out for him by proxy. And he put it to John Bull, who was extremely sensitive in his own case to the wrongs of the stomach, and whose appetite was especially remarkable, whether starvation was not a fair excuse for roaring or causing to roar. It was clear, therefore, to the demigod, that the proper course to pursue in order to tame down this Irish bull would be to relieve, thereby to pacify, the famishing population of his country. And now how? He came to ask himself. Was it that the Hibernians were fain to live upon the root which the swine did eat, that Irishmen were reduced to fare like Irish pigs? He saw in a moment that it was from the depressed state of agriculture and commerce, and that this again arose in consequence of the absence from the country of those whose presence was necessary to their promotion, the capitalists and owners of the soil. And here the question naturally suggested itself, was he to break their heads? No, it was from fear of having their heads broken that they absented themselves. The country was too hot to hold them, and now came the grand question, how was this? There is a certain culinary axiom, analogically applicable to legislation, namely, that, what is sauce for goose is sauce for gander. Now the sister island, conformably to its gender, being representable by gander, and Great Britain, in consideration of its political wisdom, by goose. It was apparent to the mind of Hercules, that, for goose and for gander, very different sauces were provided, and that gander naturally was highly indignant with her cooks. Hence her inflammatory condition, and consequently inconvenient temperature. Between Hibernia and Britannia there was one especial difference. No man who likes mutton and dislikes beef, will willingly eat beef instead of mutton. Still less willingly will he allow beef to be forced down his throat, and least of all will he willingly pay for the said beef. Now there was, in the times whereof we are writing, a species of theological beef, and a species of theological mutton. In Britannia this diversity of taste was acknowledged and accommodated, insomuch that, in a particular district of the island where veal was preferred, the other and the larger district being inhabited by beef caters, and beef eating being therein the established system, the use of veal was ratified and sanctioned by law, and men were not obliged to eat beef unless they choose, still less were they obliged to pay for it whether they ate it or not. It had been at one time attempted to force beef upon them, but they covenanted together against it and kicked it out, and thenceforward they were allowed to eat their veal in quiet. The territory in question was called Scotia. Hibernia had a peculiar appetite for mutton. Indeed, she could eat nothing else, and as she was obliged to eat something, she chose that and paid for it. Be it observed, we speak of mutton theological, for of veritable mutton poor Hibernia had little enough. But Britannia insisted on her feeding on beef, or, at all events, on paying for a supply of it. The pocket is impatient of aggression. Men do not like being taxed, whether directly or indirectly, for what they do not require. Hibernia, therefore, took the demand which was made on her of payment for the beef which she would rather have been without, extremely ill. Nor was this all. The purveyors of the popular aliment, mutton, felt themselves exceedingly aggrieved. Partly at the abstract wrong of their customers being saddled with the expense of unpalatable beef, partly because their mutton, but for that imposition, would have borne a higher price. They therefore very naturally sided with those who dealt with them, and exhorted them to clamor for liberty of mutton, and no compulsory beef, exciting the bull also to roar to the same tune. Hercules, being acquainted with these circumstances, presented himself with his club before the legislature of the United Kingdom of Britannia and Hibernia, and said how happy he should be to reduce the Irish bull, in accordance with the wishes of the bull called John, to a state of harmless domesticity. But he would not budge, he declared, till the homogeneity of the sauce for the gander with the sauce for the goose was established, and especially till the exaction for the repudiated beef was abolished. His declaration was received with much grunting, hooting, and groaning, and an abortive attempt was made to convince him that the so-called gander was no gander, but quite a different bird from the goose. Those who made this assertion knew very well that it was false, and there needed only a very few blows from the Heroes' Club to put them all to silence. But they demurred strongly to the mutton, and insisted on upholding the beef. Mutton, they contended, was unwholesome for the Hibernians. Hercules replied that they would eat nothing else. They urged that beef was the proper thing, that the benighted creatures did not know what was good for themselves. The demigod answered that beef they would not have. Then they began to panegyrize beef, but Hercules lost all patience, and knowing well that the purveyors of beef were at the bottom of all this humbug, he flew into a fit of divine wrath, and laid about him right and left, till he had drub-bed common sense and rationality into the assembly. When they at length agreed to be guided by his advice, so the sauce for the gander and the sauce for the goose were identified, the privilege of mutton was conceded to the Hibernians, and beef was left to their option. And then Hercules went over to Hibernia prepared to take the bull by the horns, and now that he had no further business to roar, to cudgel him soundly should he prove riotous. But the supply of provender, all but an eleemosynary sufficiency, had ceased. The creature was tame as a lamb, and allowed himself to be quietly conveyed by the hero to Liverpool, and thence to London, where Hercules, to show the docility of his prize, having entwined a garland of mingled rose, shamrock, and thistle around his neck, led him thereby about the principal thoroughfares, and presented him on the first court day to her Majesty the Queen.